Father and Son, USN Retired. The Life Stories of Quintin RAMIL Sr. and Jr. by Quintin R. RAMIL Jr. Published by Papyrus Books. Email papyrusbooks@yahoo.com. Dedication. Father and Son, USN Retired is dedicated to my wife Teresita, who stood behind me during this writing. To my children, Ram, Ray, Tressie, and Roxanne, who encouraged me to write my family's story. To my grandchildren, Riley Jane Kopka, Shane Reese RAMIL, Madeline Page Snowden, Reagan Therese Kopka, Reese James RAMIL Kopka, Elizabeth Quinn Snowden, and Michael RAMIL Snowden, so that they may know where their grandfather came from. By Quint RAMIL Jr., author of the book Father and Son, USN Retired, The Life Stories of Quintin RAMIL Sr. and Jr. Acknowledgements. I want to acknowledge my family and friends, especially my nieces who kept asking me how we are related to each other. To my friends Mario and Purita Firm, Janet and Lillian, who were stranded with Tara and me on one of the Caramoan Islands off Naga, Camarines Sur, Philippines. Because of the weather condition, we could not visit the other islands and were advised to just stay put. We spent many hours just telling stories. I told them the story of my father, fathering a child during the war, and they encouraged me to write a story about it. To my co-senior mentor for San Diego County, Ms. Vicki Anders, who encouraged me and gave me pointers on how to make it an interesting book. To my Ine, mother in Filipino, who always kept a journal and is really the writer in our family. By Quint RAMIL Jr. About the author. Quintin R. RAMIL Jr. retired from the U.S. Navy as a chief legal man. He was formerly a chief radio man, having served on board several submarines and was a Navy instructor. He attended Manila Central University, Manila Law College, and Palomar College, and holds a certificate as a Registered Certified Financial Advisor, RCFA, from Clayton University. He is a proud father of 4 children. Quintin, 3, and Ramon graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy, class of 86 and 88, respectively. Tressie graduated from California State University, Long Beach, with a degree in education, and Roxanne graduated from California State University, Sacramento, with a degree in communication studies. Quint's in-depth training includes special real estate courses such as Floyd Wickman's Sweat Hogs, real estate practice, economics, financing, property management, legal practice, real estate investments, and creative financing. He was the founder and charter president of the U.S. Naval Academy Parents Club of San Diego and the Phil Am Toastmasters Club of San Diego, number 9493. He holds the title of Advanced Communicator, Gold, and Community Leader. Quint and his wife of more than 50 years, Teresita Roxas RAMIL, are active in Airman's Chapel Marine Corps Air Station Miramar as choir members, reader, and Eucharistic minister, respectively. He enjoys group singing, golf, gardening, grandparenting to their 7 grandchildren, dancing, and traveling all over the world, and he also loves to tell jokes. Introduction stories. The true ones are interesting in how they develop. Some stories are buried and forgotten, some are put away for years and slowly surface, and some are gathered and released in a book because someone said that was the thing to do. Such is the case with this book. People said it was time, and more importantly, that it needed to be done. Of course, with a book, an honest book, skeletons are undoubtedly going to come out of the closet. For instance, recently while I was stranded with some friends on an island off Naga, province of Camarines Sur, Philippines, I told them the story of my dad fathering a child out of wedlock during the war, and they all implied there may be other stories there as well. So, I tried to start this, but for some reason I kept postponing it. Maybe some of those skeletons weren't ready to come out yet. Who knows? But one day opportunity presented itself. I had to get some things done in the Philippines by myself, and I found the time to do it. I had no more excuses. This is the result of that very focused time, encompassing more than 74 years. This includes time from my father and his stories, and my stories, all wrapped up in family. I was the only one of 7 children who followed my father's footsteps, which included time on board U.S. Navy ships. Please understand this is not a sailor's diary. This is a glimpse behind the scenes of a family, friends, and neighbors who, in ways both large and small, shaped part of the world in which we live in. Some names have been intentionally changed to protect the innocent. Prologue. Every family has its members and friends, those who help create the story. These are some of mine. My grandfather, Emeterio Ramil, was born in the barrio of Carino, town of Paniqui, province of Tarlac in the Philippines. He was married to Maria Apuan from the town of Anao, Tarlac, and they had 6 children. The oldest, a daughter, Valentina, was married to Pablo Llanos, whose ancestors were from Bacara, Ilocos Norte, as were the Ramils. The second child, a son named Lope, settled in the town of Cuyapo, province of Nueva Ecija, after marrying Imen Reginaldo. The third child, a son Pedro, became a minister of the IEMILIF, Iglesia Evangelica Metodista in Las Islas Filipinas Church, a local version of the Methodist Church, and married Maria Bernardino from the town of Novaliches, city of Caloocan, in the province of Rizal. He was assigned as a pastor in the town. The fourth child, Quintin, was named after his uncle, Quintin Apuan, locally known as Pop by the Americans, as he had a fatherly look and owned a bar in Pasay, a city in the outskirts of Manila. The fifth, a daughter, Rosalia, never married and was active as a deaconess in the Methodist Church in the town of Paniqui, Tarlac. The sixth, a daughter named Consolacion, was a nurse who graduated from Mary Johnston Hospital in the town of Tondo, city of Manila. She encouraged my mother to give birth at Mary Johnston Hospital. She served in the Philippine Army Nurse Corps during the war. Living on a farm, Quintin helped his father tend to the animals. His primary duties were to make sure that their carabaos or water buffaloes were taken to the river at least once a day, where they would drink, wade, and swim and were given a scrubbing. The family raised rice and a variety of vegetables like tomatoes, squash, bitter melons, eggplants, and many more. They also had several coconut trees. I still remember my grandfather bringing all these goodies to their home in Novaliches in the 1950s. Once, while Quintin was herding his team of carabaos, he found himself in the middle of a swollen river. The animals were having a difficult time crossing and were actually being swept by the strong current. He almost drowned, but managed to keep the animals together and successfully crossed the river. After graduating from high school, he was informed by his older brother Pedro that a new dam will be constructed in Novaliches. They were hiring anyone old enough, but they will be required to have their own carabao and cart, and of course a shovel and a pick. He did not waste any time. He borrowed a cart from his oldest brother, Lope, and with one of the family carabaos, he gathered his menial belongings and proceeded to travel from Carino to Novaliches, a suburb in the city of Caloocan. He traveled during the day and camped out by the roadside at night. I am still amazed as to how he managed to reach Novaliches, which was about 120 kilometers away. It took him more than a month before he reached Novaliches. He stayed with his brother while working at what is now known as La Mesa Dam Eco Park. It was at this time when he met Fausta M. Reyes, a seamstress working at a haberdashery store owned by a Mr. Zacharias Biglang-Awa, a relative. Fausta is the daughter of Reverend Arcadio Reyes, also a minister of the Philippine version of the Methodist Church, and was also assigned in Novaliches as co-pastor of Pedro Ramil. Quintin met the daughter of the co-pastor of his brother. She was only 17 years old. He saw her almost every Sunday in church. It was very common for the pastors and their family to have lunch together after the service, and that was the opportunity for him to get to know her better. Arcadio was single when he married Gregoria Matos, a widow with 2 young children, the oldest, a daughter named Onang, and a son, Martin. Onang lived with her family in the town of Marikina and was always a welcome sight when she visited our family. She would always have goodies for us. Arcadio and Gregoria had 3 children of their own. The oldest, a girl they named Fausta. The second and third, both boys, were named Mateo or Tayong and Canuto or Otong respectively. Canuto died at an early age. He was walking in a rice field when a deadly snake struck him. This was very common in the Philippines. He left a wife, Maxima Franco Reyes, and 2 children, a son named Ruben and a daughter, Gloria. Mateo married Siriaca Bernabe from a nearby barrio, and their marriage was blessed with 8 children. The oldest, a son, was named Alfredo or Eddie, who was only a few months older than me. The second, another son, was named Ernesto or P.I. The third, a son named Ronaldo or Small, as he looked like our grandfather. The fourth, a daughter, was named Teresita and is married to Dr. Jerry Canless and now lives in Orlando, Florida. The fifth is Romulo, who stayed with us when I was stationed at Naval Communication Station, Philippines, and he was also able to visit us in San Diego. The sixth is Arcadio, or Archie, who went to dental school but did not practice as he went abroad and settled in San Jose, California with his family. The seventh is Carlos, who still lives in Novaliches with his family. The youngest is Fernando. He owns several businesses and lives in Lipa City, Batangas. I have visited his 3 farms where he breeds fighting cocks, dogs, and racing horses. He owns a funeral home in the city of Lipa, province of Batangas. Chapter 1. Enlisting in the U.S. Navy. Working under the hot summer sun for days and days, digging and shoveling dirt was so backbreaking. He did this for more than 2 years. The only thing he could look forward to was on Sundays when he would attend the service at his brother's church. On many occasions, he would join the family for lunch. It was in one these occasions when he was introduced to the oldest daughter of the other pastor, Fausta Reyes. Quintin decided to go to the city to find a better job. He takes his carabao and cart and proceeded to Manila and temporarily finds a job as an all-around helper in a Catholic church in the city of Malate, a suburb of Manila. His many duties included cleaning the church and the facilities. On Sundays, he would also assist as an altar boy for the masses. Then he heard that the U.S. Navy was recruiting Filipinos. He tried to get information from anyone. He knew that there would be an examination, so he began studying and did a lot of praying. He was lucky enough to pass the exam. This was to be the turning point in his life. The dream of many young Filipinos is to be able to go to America. In his joy and excitement, he went to Luneta, a park in the city of Manila, and let his aging carabao loose as he knew he would soon board a transport ship that will take him and his fellow recruits to America. Today there is a monument in Luneta which could be a tribute to the carabao found roaming freely in that park many years ago. Quintin was sworn into the U.S. Navy in July 1929. He took his training in Great Lakes, Illinois. It was here that he became involved with an American woman. It was unclear where she lived, but he fathered a son, and they named him Carlos RAMIL. While stationed aboard several ships in the Pacific Fleet, my dad was a boxer in the Navy and was at one time the all-Navy champion in the 118-pound division. One of his teammates was Federico Ramirez, whose family also lived in Novaliches and has a son named Rico. We met for the first time in 1948 when their family returned to the Philippines from Rhode Island and stopped by to visit us in Hawaii. Today, Fred lives with his family in Suisun, California. He is a retired Master Sergeant from the U.S. Air Force. As a Navy man, my dad fulfilled what was expected of him by his parents. This has been a tradition that is still going on today. Parents expect their children to provide for them. The goal of most Filipinos is to finish school so he or she can help their parents provide for the rest of the siblings. Early on, my father established a scholarship for his younger sister and his oldest niece. He helped Consolacion and Maria Ramil Llanos finish their studies. These 2 ladies became nurses and in turn helped their own families. I remember my manang, older relative Mareng, providing financial assistance for her siblings even after she had her own family. This is a very noble tradition common to many Filipino families. He continued to write Fausta, and they were exchanging letters every week. After 4 years in the U.S. Navy, my dad returned to the Philippines to marry the woman who would become our mother, Fausta M. Reyes. I believe that at one time, my mother told me that they were engaged for almost 6 years. The marriage took place in Novaliches on December 2, 1934. Looking at their wedding picture, I noticed that one of the bridesmaids was Tia Akang, the wife of Uncle Mateo, and one of the sponsors was Faustino Reyes, a brother of my grandfather. Lolo Tino, as we knew him, was one of the first Filipinos recruited by the American Pineapple Company to work as a laborer in Hawaii. He was recruited in 1928. It was my father who met him in Hawaii and advised him to return to the Philippines before the war broke out. He returned and was able to buy land in the outskirts of Novaliches. Dad continued to be stationed aboard many ships in the Pacific Fleet, including one that was part of the Great White Fleet that sailed around the world. After 4 years, my mother gave birth to her first child. I was born on April 12, 1938. To my surprise, when I obtained a copy of my birth certificate from Mary Johnston Hospital in 1956, my birth date was recorded as April 11th. It was obvious that the nurse who entered the date came to work on April 11th, but I was born 10 minutes after midnight on the night of April 11th, and so for 17 years I celebrated my birthday on the 12th. Today I do the only sensible thing and celebrate it on both days. Sometime in 1941, my dad received orders to the USS Chaumont, a submarine tender home ported in Sangley Point Naval Base, Cavite, Philippines. My parents rented an apartment in Ermita, Manila, close to the highway that goes to Cavite, and he would commute from Ermita to Sangley Point Navy Base by bus. In November of 1941, the USS Sargo, a submarine, tied up to the USS Chaumont, a submarine tender, needing a steward and was asking for volunteers. My dad volunteered and became a crew member of the USS Sargo, SS-188. In early December, the USS Sargo was ordered to hold an open house in Manila Bay, which was very close to his apartment in Ermita, a suburb of the city of Manila. He was off that weekend, but returned to his submarine to pick up his paycheck. He planned to take me with him, but my mom said that she was going to give me a bath, and that was the only reason I stayed behind. When my dad arrived at his ship, he was barely on board when Japanese planes began bombing the city of Manila. This was December 8, 1941. The very same time Pearl Harbor was being attacked. As the USS Sargo was backing away from the pier, it was hit by a torpedo fired by one of the fighter planes. The Sargo lost one of its propellers. The crew could not help but see the devastation Manila suffered. My dad saw the whole city burning. He honestly believed that he lost his family. With one propeller, the Sargo still managed to reach Australia, where my dad again volunteered for another submarine to go on a patrol. It was his compadre, Brigido Tamayo, my godfather, who advised him to rest for a while and not go on another patrol just yet. This is what saved him, as the submarine he was to board did not return and was listed as lost at sea. At this time, he was due for rotation and received orders for Panama, where he was to become the commissary store officer. He was promoted to chief. As a commissary store officer, he was in charge of a big grocery store where many Panamanian women worked. It was there he met Ina, one of the store's cashiers. Believing that he no longer had a family, he and Ina lived together and became lovers. In 1942, Ina gave birth to a daughter and they named her Gwen. The three of them lived together as a family, and he loved his daughter very much. He told me that Gwen would run after him when he left for work and always ran to greet him when he returned. Unknown to him, he also had a daughter, Norma, who was born during the war. When he left Panama, he asked one of his men, Petty Officer Manuel Archuleta, to look after his loved ones for him. As his chief, Mr. Archuleta had a very good relationship with my father and considered him as his idol and mentor. He not only took care of Ina, but he also married her and adopted her daughter. They did not have any children of their own. Eventually, they settled in San Diego, California. Gwen grew up not knowing any other father except for Mr. Archuleta. Chapter 2. Life during the war. The people of the city of Manila were in panic. Bombs were exploding, buildings were burning, and the sounds of sirens were everywhere. The whole population must have been on the move, as all modes of transportation were packed with people. I still do not know how my grandfather, the Reverend Arcadio Reyes, managed to get to the city from our town of Novaliches, a distance of about 30 miles, in order to help his daughter and grandson evacuate. We were walking and running and trying to get a ride to the countryside. With one suitcase in hand and me perched on his shoulders, my grandfather just kept on walking with my mom close behind, carrying some bags of whatever she could take with her. We managed to get to the city known as Blumentritt. This is where the buses bound for our town of Novaliches begin their route. Looking back and placing myself in my grandfather's shoes, I cannot imagine what a father would do when he heard that the city where his only daughter and grandson was living was being bombed, and the whole city was burning. He took the first bus he could to go to Manila and just ran towards Ermita. My grandfather and mother walked from Ermita to Blumentritt, a distance of about 10 miles. No bus would stop for anyone except when specifically given orders by someone in a position to do so. That was my Uncle Canuto. He was a Halili bus inspector and well liked by his drivers. He gave specific instructions to any drivers who happened to see his father and sister to pick them up. Before long, a bus full of people stopped for us. We arrived in Novaliches, where we owned a big house just off the main road. It was a 2-story home with the main floor portion converted into a sari-sari store. Sari-sari means variety, a small convenience store. There was a Japanese fellow, married to a Filipina, that used to deliver goods to my mom's store. He lived in the area and was known by the community. He in turn knew about everyone else, and this was the problem. He knew that my dad was a member of the U.S. Navy. As soon as the Japanese forces landed, Appa, as he was popularly known, also donned his Japanese Army uniform. He was with the intelligence unit of the Japanese Imperial Army. The first group of Japanese soldiers to land was the Korean detachment. They were the meanest bunch of soldiers in the world, and they proved it. This was the group that killed babies by tossing them in the air and spearing them with their bayonets. They raped women as they made their way around the countryside. Thanks to Appa, our family name, RAMIL was instantly on their wanted list because we were related to a member of the United States military. Many of our neighbors and townmates were leaving our town, and so our family also began making preparations. My mom was pregnant, so we had to wait until she gave birth to my sister, Norma, who was named after a movie actress, Norma Blancaflor. She was born on July 10, 1942. Soon my grandfather decided that we all join his brother, Faustino, who recently returned from Hawaii and was able to buy a farm in the outskirts of Novaliches, known as Pasong Putik. It was my father who ran into him in Honolulu just before the war and suggested that he return to the Philippines. He had a house big enough for 2 families and about an acre of land to plant vegetables. There was also a river and a creek nearby loaded with fish, shrimp, and freshwater clams. My cousins and I were oblivious of the world's situation. We were happy doing what was expected from us. The 2 families were my uncle Tayong and his family, my mother and my grandmother and grandfather, and our great-uncle Lolo, Grandpa Tino. There were 4 of us kids, my 2 cousins Eddie and Ernesto, my sister Norma, and me. Eddie, who was a few months older than me, was almost 5 years old. He was my partner in doing our assigned chores. We always did things together as we were the oldest of the kids. Our duties were to fetch water from a well, which was about 300 yards from our house. It was located between the river and the creek. We also had to fish, hunt, and gather fruits and firewood. We learned how to catch shrimps by making a hideout for them. We assembled and bundled twigs and tied them together. Then we lowered the trap in the deep part of the creek and left it there overnight. In the morning, we would take a net and place it under the twigs. Shrimps would be jumping as we raised the net to the surface. We would gather them and take them home to be cooked by my aunt or my mother. Our grandfather also taught us how to build fish traps. We would dig out a small portion of the riverbank, make a sort of a tunnel, and build a fence to enclose the hollowed portion of the riverbank. The fence was made of bamboos. The 2 middle pieces rest on a stick, which acted as the trigger. These 2 pieces of bamboo fence were heavier than the rest, as it is packed with mud on top. When a fish enters the fenced-in area, it would touch the stick and will cause the weighted pieces to drop down. We caught a lot of fish this way. We also raised a lot of plants, like yams, corn, rice, and several varieties of vegetables. I can say one thing: although many suffered hungers, our family was lucky enough to always have food for our existence. Our grandfather also taught us how to build animal traps. We caught quails, monitor lizards, and even a young wild pig. We also became very good with our slingshots. I remember hitting a dove once while it was flying. We would also gather all kinds of fruits as the tropical climate was so conducive to local fruit trees, and the abundance of papayas, star apples, jackfruits, santol, and the ever-available guavas made our life bearable. My favorite was gathering jicamas or sincamas in Tagalog. It grows all over, and it was very easy to find. We would dig it from the ground using a pointed stick. This was our snack, and it was so good. I particularly liked the small ones because they were sweeter and much juicier than the big ones. There were a lot of yucca roots, or what we call kamoteng kahoy. This was my second favorite. We would just pull the whole plant off the ground and we would place it on the bonfire. When the fire is out, our feast begins. Oh, and about Appa, the Japanese spy? We found out later on that a group of Filipino guerrillas were able to get hold of him after he donned his uniform and killed him. I believe that he did not have enough time to give his report to his superiors. Our first order of business was to build an air raid shelter. We found the ideal location. Not far from our house were 3 mature santal trees. The trunks were about 3 feet in diameter, a local fruit that is sweet and sour and grows wild in our area. Growing in a cluster but far enough from each other that we were able to dig out an air raid shelter between the 3 trees. Our 2 grandfathers and Uncle Taeyong took turns digging using a pick and a shovel. It took them almost a week to finally finish the digging, and when it was finished, it measured 6 feet by 8 feet and about 8 feet deep. We covered it over with bamboos, palm leaves, and dirt. It had a built-in step so we can actually walk down into it. There was enough space for all of us, especially if we huddled. In one corner, we stacked emergency supply of water in a big jug. We actually hid in the shelter whenever we hear unknown airplanes flying in the area. It also served as a very good hiding place when us kids played hide and seek. On one occasion, a platoon of Japanese soldiers got lost and ended up at our place. They decided to take a break and wanted to use our fire pit to cook their rice. Of course, they did not have to ask for our permission. The problem was, at about that time, a U.S. spotter plane was in the area, and my grandfather was afraid that the pilot might just start shooting at the Japanese soldiers. So my grandfather literally pulled them and suggested they hide under the trees. He was ignored, and they continued just sitting around in the open enjoying their lunch. It was a good thing that the spotter plane did not do anything else and continued its flight. This was a sign that big things were about to happen. Little did we know that General MacArthur was only a few days away from his promise to return. We could sense that even the Japanese soldiers knew their days were getting short. They were no longer as mean as they used to be. At this time, we made a plan to go to town to check out our house, as we heard that it was occupied by a Japanese detachment and made into their headquarters. Because the civilians were no longer in great danger, my mom, Auntie Akang, Eddie, and I went down to the town. We arrived at our house and saw the damage done by the soldiers that occupied it. It is now abandoned and run down. It was vandalized after the soldiers left. We saw some of what was left of our furniture after using it as firewood. Even parts of our house were burned. Garbage was strewn all around, and the whole place was in disarray. We attempted to clean it as best we could, and as we were rummaging through the kitchen cabinets, my aunt found some flour, which we managed to take back with us. When we arrived at the farm, my aunt did not waste any time. She started preparing dough from the flour she found and made some butsi. This is like fritters made from flour dough and filled with sweetened yams and then deep fried. It is a very tasty and sought-after delicacy. My cousin Eddie and I were down at the river checking on our traps, so we were not around when the first batch of butsi were passed out to everyone. Our great-uncle Faustino ate the most, and all of a sudden his mouth began to froth and he went into convulsions. The others who had eaten the fritters also began experiencing food poisoning. This was the time everyone realized that the flour we found was not really flour but rat poison. Those who ate the butsi were given chunks of cubed brown cane sugar by my grandmother. This was a cure she learned early on. This is probably what saved us. Unfortunately, our granduncle Faustino was not able to recuperate. He died shortly, probably within 2 weeks. He was not able to see the Americans return. It just dawned on me that, was my mother, Fausta, named after our great-uncle? I should have known. After several weeks and after our great-uncle's funeral, my mom decided to return to our house. This we did. It took us several days to make our house livable again. Lucky for us, our artesian well was still working. We had clean water and the pump was still functional. The storage tank on top of the roof was still in good condition. Our life was slowly turning normal. My uncle and his family lived across the street from us, and they too were settled in. My grandfather and grandmother lived with us, as our mother is their ini, or only daughter. One night, there was a big commotion, and we heard gunshots. We were told to leave the area as the Americans had landed, and a big fight with the Japanese soldiers would take place. We were to go to the next town. Everyone was on the move. Most of our relatives managed to stay together as we made our way to the next town. The road was packed with people. There was no way you could move about. You occupied your space and you just moved forward in unison. We traveled all night, and at daybreak we arrived at the next town called Bagbag. Here we settled and rested our weary bodies just sitting by the side of the road. There were rice fields all around, and we just laid there resting. We were told later on that behind us were the Japanese soldiers. They cleverly used us as their shield in the cover of the night. Once daylight came, they ran back into the woods. The Americans had not landed, so it was a false alarm. We slowly returned to our houses, a distance of about 10 miles. Not long afterwards, we did see some American planes. They were firing at the fleeing Japanese soldiers. Chapter 3: American Landing. All we heard were the roar and scrapping of tanks and bulldozers clearing the roadways. Before long, a temporary bridge was built over the Tuliahan River that runs through our town. Then we saw a convoy of trucks, called 6x6, loaded with American soldiers. This was the first time for me to see an American. I could not figure out what they were chewing. I had never seen chewing gum before. Then they set up camp in the town park. It consisted of several tents complete with a dining hall and sleeping areas with portable cots. They also built portable showers and bathrooms. After every meal, they would pass out their leftovers. There would be a line, mostly of kids, including me, carrying 1-gallon cans, and as we passed through, the cooks would scoop the leftovers into our cans. You never knew what you would get, especially since we only had 1 can and they just filled it up with whatever. When I arrived home, my mom would sort it out. I remember getting some ham once. This was a jackpot for me. I became friends with many of the soldiers at that camp, but mostly with the cooks who I would try to impress by speaking some English words that my mom taught me. Mom also took in some laundry from the soldiers. She would accept their laundry and she would wash them in the river, dry them under the sun, and then iron them. I remember a Mr. Remlo and a Mr. Kurtz as 2 of her customers. These 2 would look out for me when I got in line for leftovers. They would make sure I got some extras. Soon the Americans left our town, and a little bit of normalcy returned. I was soon enrolled in kindergarten. My grandparents still lived with us, and we had not heard from our father. We checked with the Philippine National Red Cross and found out that he was alive. I always knew that we would see him again. It never crossed my mind that he could have gotten killed. Incidentally, the submarine that he was to go on patrol with from Australia did not return and was declared lost at sea. I guess my godfather, Brigito Tamayo, who advised him not to volunteer, saved his life. I was told that during my baptismal, my Ninong godfather brought with him his fiancée, Petronila Pimentel, from the city of Olongapo province of Zambales. At this time, my grandfather was assigned to a church in Banlat, a town nearby, as its pastor. On Sundays, he would take me with him. I remember that my mom would dress me up in a sailor suit, and I knew some Tagalog poems which I would recite in front of the congregation before the start of the service. I would get standing ovations. After the service, we would be invited to various homes for lunch, and I remember I would be given a special treat by our hosts. My grandfather was so proud of me. During the week, he would hunt and stuff animals and birds like eagles and hawks, as he was a taxidermist on the side. He caught pythons, monitor lizards, and big birds using different traps. He also collected butterflies and preserved them in picture frames. He would then peddle his goods to the different universities in Manila, selling to students and faculty. When he returned, he would always have goodies of us grandkids. Philippine liberation and the return of my father. My mom heard an announcement over the radio telling all U.S. military dependents to report to the Philippine National Red Cross in Manila to be accounted for, so the 3 of us accompanied by my grandfather went to Manila to register. This is how my dad learned that we were alive. He immediately requested to be assigned to the Philippines and was lucky enough to be given orders to report to the Philippine Sea Frontier Command in Pasay, a suburb of Manila. It is very close to the waterfront and very far from Novaliches. My dad decided to purchase a house in Pasay. He found a new house next to his uncle QUINTIN, who lived with his family at Libertad, Pasay. Our house was behind the City Pie Bakery on F.B. Harrison Street, between Concepcion Street and Salud Street. It was just a few blocks from the base. My mom and my sister, Norma, joined him and lived there. I would continue living with my grandparents in Novaliches as I was already in school. I would join them on weekends, and I still managed to make many friends there. This was the time when we would play house and actually try to cook meals. Most of the time, I found myself just playing with my sister Norma. I remember we were running in a circular motion, and for some reason I turned and met her head on. We both suffered cuts, and my scar is still visible today. I remember also that this was the very first time I was ever spanked by my father. I did not want to sleep alone in my bedroom, and I insisted that I sleep next to them. I had to be spanked, and I can honestly say that I learned a lesson because that was the first and only time I was ever spanked by my father. Another incident that I will always remember is one weekend, my godparents, Mr. and Mrs. Brigito Tamayo, were visiting with their son, Brigito, Jr. And I must have played very hard that day, as they said I fell asleep earlier than normal, and they all decided to go to the base for some ice cream. I was left behind with our maid as I was in a deep slumber. Later on, when I woke up, they were nowhere to be found. I went into a fit as I wanted so much to also eat ice cream at the base. That was the best part of visiting my parents on weekends. Some Sundays, I would be with my grandfather in his new assignment as the new pastor of a church in the town of Zapote, city of Bacoor, province of Cavite. It was the same routine. I would do some declamation, and I would be given treats by members of the congregation. My grandfather was well known for having a grandson that recited poems before the service began. Chapter 4, Leaving for Hawaii. After 2 years, my dad was once again due for transfer. He received orders to the Naval Air Station at Ford Island, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. This time he had the option of taking his family with him. There are now 3 kids as my mother gave birth to a third child, a son, and he was named after our grandmother, Maria Apuan Ramil. Thus, his name is Mario, who was born on June 21, 1946. Our family left for Hawaii in July of 1947 aboard the USNS Daniel Juan Sultan, an MSTS military ship transportation service ship. We arrived in Hawaii after sailing the Pacific for 21 days. We lived in a converted Quonset hut in a Navy housing for enlisted personnel and their families called Moanalua Navy Housing. It was next to the Navy Marine Golf Course, not very far from the Naval Station Pearl Harbor. Norma and I enrolled at Pearl Harbor Kai Elementary School. I was in grade 5 and she was in grade 1. My teacher was Mrs. Giddens. One of my classmates was the son of my father's ex-shipmate, Pacifico Jose Jr. They were from Cavite, Philippines. They lived next door to us, and we both joined the Cub Scouts. Another neighbor who arrived later was my godparents and their son Brigito Jr., who became junior number 3. I was junior number 2, as Pacifico, who came ahead of us, was known as junior number 1 in the Cub Scouts. Another family friend that also lived in the housing was Uncle Jose de Vega and Auntie Socorro de Vega. They had a son, Joe, and a daughter, Isa. Jose de Vega Jr. later on became an actor on Broadway and in the movies. He played the part of Chino in the movie West Side Story. Auntie Saco de Vega was friends with the Archuleta family as she and Ina came from the same town in Panama. My father was going through the telephone white pages when he found the name of his uncle, Feliciano Apuan, a cousin of his mother, and lives in Kalihi, a town close to Honolulu, with his family. I remember meeting Auntie Orang, Uncle Johnny, and Auntie Mary. I am still in touch with Auntie Mary today, as she lives with her husband in Anaheim. Auntie Mary and her husband, John Buntrock, were able to attend our 50th wedding anniversary celebration last October 20th, 2012. The cousins that I remember were Fidel, Lita, Peggy, and Bernard. The other relatives were the Ben Parasos from Kaimuki and the Villars from Waipahu. We were particularly close to our two aunts, Nora and another Mary, who were single at that time and had many suitors. On some occasions, they would go to see Filipino movies, and they would bring Norma and me along so we could translate for them. But most of the time, we would go with my ninong and ninang to the base theater. It only cost 8 cents to see a movie on base. My godfather had a car with a rumble seat, and that is where Brig and I would sit. These were fun times for us. At this time, I was getting interested in girls, and one of my classmates in the 6th grade was Joanne Blakely. Sometimes I would see her at the movie, and she would invite me to sit next to her. I would end up holding hands with her, and we did a lot of studying together. If ever there was a term for this, I would say it was first love or puppy love. A year later, my mom would give birth to her 4th child, a son, and he was named Aloha Lindo. He was born on July 2nd, 1948, at Tripler Army Hospital. I remember the fireworks going off in the sky over Pearl Harbor on our way home after picking them up from the hospital. Al, as he is called today, is the only Hawaii-born child of our parents. Our other adventures in Hawaii included going to the different beaches. Once we were at Kihi Lagoon, a military beach by Honolulu International Airport, when my sister Norma, while playing in the water, was swept by an unexpected wave to the deep part of the beach. She started screaming and was beginning to sink when Pacifico Junior No. 1 dove in and saved her from drowning. I was too far to even make a move, and we were so thankful that Pac was actually very close to her to be able to do something about it. On many occasions, we would go with our cousins and relatives around the island, stopping at some scenic areas like the Mormon Temple, and stopping at any beach for lunch. One of my cousins, Fidel Antonio Jr., would sometimes spend the weekend with us. He was much older than me, and I remember that it was he who taught me how to tell time. I saw him in Hawaii for the last time in 1949 when we left. I didn't see him again until I saw him in San Diego in 1990, when he was living in the San Diego suburbs in a small town called Santee with his family. I also spent some weekends with the Villars in Waipahu. Leela, or Grandma, is also our grandmother's cousin. My cousins David and Dolly were the ones that would entertain me. My Auntie Rose and Auntie Nora would also take me shopping and buy clothes for me. It was Leela, or Grandma, who would always cook pinakbet, a Philippine dish of different kinds of vegetables, mostly from their garden, and always served with fried spam. You know, I always knew that Hawaii consumes the most spam in the United States. Our Leela never failed to serve it to us whenever we came to visit them. Friends from school. In the 6th grade, my teacher was Ms. Tom. Some of my classmates who come to mind are Peter Crumpacker, whose father became an admiral in the Navy Supply Corps, Charles Stringfellow, David Shoup, David Ross, whose father would be a shipmate of mine aboard the USS Tecumseh, SSBN 628, David Story, Skippy Moore, Donald Wong, Edward Cleveland, Shirley Johnson, Carol Bow, Constance Smith, and Marjorie Sanderson. Others who I can recall only by their first name are Rosemary, Mildred, and Natalie. Playmates and neighborhood kids I remember were Ronnie Johnson, Angela Hope, Joanne and Bobby Blakely, Jean, Linda, Betty, and Butch Conger, the son of our Cub Scouts den father. I was also a member of the Junior Police Officer, or JPO. Our uniforms were a long-sleeved white shirt, long black tie, and khaki pants. We directed traffic in front of our school before and after class. We knew a lot of families that we always attended parties with. They were also Navy families. They were the Lunas, the Cabreras, who had a daughter named Lucy, the Hoses with their children Joe and Jolinda, the Ramirezes and their daughter Millie, the Ramoses family. Their son Danny was principal of Marian Catholic High School in Imperial Beach, California, and we had a chance to reminisce in 1988. Others were the De Vegas, the Batoons, the Tortonas, whose daughter Marietta was also a crush of mine, the Castanedas, whose children were Don, Norma, and Cesar, the Saldanias, who became godparents to Lindo, and their children were Toto and Connie. While living in Hawaii, our family car was a Jeep with canvas roof that could be put down. Norma and I would be in the back, and Mario was always seated on our mom's lap. There was an incident when we went to see a Filipino movie at Palama Theater downtown. When we were ready to leave the parking lot, A big dog like a collie jumped in the back with us. We actually had no choice but to give that dog a ride as he would not get off. I do not remember what happened. All I remember was he jumped off our Jeep as soon as we reached our house at Moanalua Navy Housing. Chapter 5. Return to the Philippines. Dad retired from the U.S. Navy after 20 years and decided to return to the Philippines to enroll in school using his GI Bill of Rights. He already earned his retainer pay. This is equivalent to 75% of his base pay. He would also get paid for going to school. Upon our return to Novaliches, Dad decides to enroll at the Manila Law College to take up law. He rented an apartment in Manila and would only come home on weekends. His roommate in the apartment was Artemio Ramil, our cousin, the son of my dad's oldest brother, Lope. Artemio would later on join the U.S. Navy also with the assistance of my father. Art was married to Aurora Halili, a law graduate. They met in college and now live in Huntington Beach. They have 5 children, Tita, Gloria, Arlene, and Leonardo, or Joho. Last October 25th, Aurora, Arlene and my wife and I joined our cousins Manuel and Mila Ramil from Philadelphia. We were part of a group that went on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. We were in Jordan and Jerusalem for 12 days. The 4 of us spent 3 days in New York, sightseeing in Manhattan, and we saw a play on Broadway before flying to Istanbul, Turkey, then to Amman, Jordan, and taking a bus to Nazareth. I want to add that the day after we left Jerusalem, the Hamas started to fire their missiles there. And on the day we left New York for the Holy Land, Typhoon Sandy hit Manhattan. While in law school, my dad was very active in student government. He was president of his class for many terms. He was also very active in the local community. He co-founded the Novaliches Capital Site Club, whose membership included prominent residents of Novaliches, such as Dr. Felipe Roque, Councilor Enrique Ramirez, Dr. Dick Austria, Mr. Riawet, Mamerto Miranda, Mr. Primo Rivera, and many more. He was also involved in the school's Parent-Teachers Association. I was a freshman in high school, and I enrolled at the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Memorial College, or FDRMC. My classmates were Ernesto Santos, Eugenia Ramirez, Teresita Draco, Lourdes Mojica, Oscar Lucero, Federico Geronimo, and Segundo Manese, who after our graduation was able to join the U.S. Coast Guard, and I ran into him in San Francisco in late 1980s. Our school was in a building owned by a General Francisco, one of the first generals who graduated from the Philippine Military Academy. He was one of my early idols in Novaliches. I remember he had a booming voice perfect for giving commands. His wife was known as Generala and was involved in many community projects, and I secretly admired the whole family. There were 2 more additions to our family. A daughter was named after our grandmother. Gregoria was born November 10, 1949. Her name was later changed to Gloria for short. Yes, she is now known as Gloria Ramil Omania, Chief of Staff to State Senator Tom Torlaxon. On September 26, 1951, Cesar was born. Both of them were born at home, attended by a local midwife, Lola Putenciana. She was our mom's godmother. We met her daughter, Virginia, in 2011 when we visited Novaliches with our mom. Chapter 6. My Teenage Years. I learned to drive a Jeep at an early age because my uncle and auntie were engaged in the buy and sell business. You can say they had a route that started from Blumentritt to La Mesa Dam. Yes, this is the same dam that my dad helped build. Every day, the 2 of them would drive to Blumentritt to buy groceries, which included meat and vegetables and different ingredients. The Jeep would be packed at the start, and as they proceeded towards Novaliches, their customers along the way would just gather around them at their designated stops. By the time they reached our place, they would be about 90% sold out. This is when Eddie and I would take over the driving, as my uncle would rest and finish the required paperwork. My aunt would remain doing what she was so good at doing, and that is to peddle the rest of her goods to her waiting customers, or suki. Eddie and I would take turns doing the driving, and we did this every day until we became very good at it, and we knew every policeman in our town. We were able to get away as minors driving without a license and no insurance. At 11 years old, I considered myself an expert driver. My close friends were Ernesto Martin, Celedonio Collado, who was one of our groomsmen, my cousin Eddie, Rico Ramirez, the same guy who visited us in Hawaii on their way to the Philippines from Rhode Island, Demetrio Belmes, Boy Ramirez, Mandong Cruz, Cesar Roque, and many more. Our gang built a swimming hole in the Tuliahan River by clearing a lot of debris. My uncle gave us an old steel cable, and we tied one end on the trunk of a big sampoy tree, and on the other end we fashioned a wooden handle made from a guava branch. We would swing on the cable, and as we were on the deep part, we would do all kinds of acrobatic moves before we would let go of the cable. This was so much fun for us. We called this place Pasong Choi for no reason, and we did a lot of Tarzan maneuvers using this cable that gave us about 15 feet drop to about 10 feet deep water. During the rainy season, the Tuliahan River would be so swollen that water would almost reach the bridge by our place. This was the perfect time for us to construct a raft made from banana trunks, which was plentiful as the wind would knock down many banana trees. We would then gather some trunks and connect them together with cacahuate, a plant that grows everywhere in the area, sticks, and then tie them with a rope. This would be strong enough to hold the banana trunks together and act as a raft enough for about 4 people to ride the current of the swollen river. We would start from the bridge, which was at Tabing Ilog, Riverside, in Novaliches, and end up at Pasong Choi, close to the town of Kebiga, about 10 miles downstream. This is also the same river where I learned how to swim because I fell in and I learned because of fear. I also taught my brother Mario how to swim using the same method. These were exciting times for us, and even today, Fred or Rico and I would reminisce about our adventures in the river. During this time, my dad graduated from law school, but he was not able to take the Philippine bar exam as he retained his U.S. citizenship. He devoted his time in several business ventures like poultry farming, tilapia raising, a poultry supply store, and jukeboxes. I was the one who attended maintenance training for our jukeboxes, and so that was my duties. I was going to school in the evening, and in the daytime I would take care of our jukeboxes, which included minor repairs. Replacing the records and dealing with the business owners and actually counting the money for dividing and giving the profit to my mom. We placed 3 jukeboxes into the 3 cafes in our town, and they were all trying to compete with each other for customers. We did very well because this was very new to our town, and many young suitors would play the appropriate record, hoping that their loved one would hear the music. I was then courting Rosemarie Susano, the daughter of the owner of Novaliches Market. Once we went to a movie in Manila, and on our way home when we boarded the bus, her mother was also on board the same bus. She became very angry and was raising her voice, so I decided to get off, and I waited for the next one. I was worried because I overheard her say she was going to tell my father. She was a teacher in the elementary school where my father was the PTA president. It even crossed my mind that I may be forced to marry Rosemary. I did not hear anything from my father, and I continued seeing her. Before long, we were able to buy the 2 lots adjacent to ours. One lot is where we started our poultry farm. In the other lot, he built a small commercial building, and one of our cousins started a barber shop. Today, that lot has a bank building, but it does not belong to us anymore. Then my dad leased 1 rice paddy from a Mr. Pedro Valenzuela, a friend of his, which he converted into a fish pond. The government had a program and was just starting to introduce the tilapia fish to the country. They provided free seedlings to anyone that had a pond, and we were the first one to have a tilapia pond in Novaliches. Dad even had a small concrete pond in the side of our house where we also had tilapia for our home consumption. It was so cool to cast your pole and the fishes would bite it instantly. Most of the time we would have burning ambers for instant fish barbecue. Chapter 4, Leaving for Hawaii. After 2 years, my dad was once again due for transfer. He received orders to the Naval Air Station at Ford Island, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. This time he had the option of taking his family with him. There are now 3 kids as my mother gave birth to a 3rd child, a son, and he was named after our grandmother, Maria Apuan Ramil. Thus, his name is Mario, who was born on June 21, 1946. Our family left for Hawaii in July of 1947 aboard the USNS Daniel Juan Sultan, an MSTS military ship transportation service ship. We arrived in Hawaii after sailing the Pacific for 21 days. We lived in a converted Quonset hut in a Navy housing for enlisted personnel and their families called Moanalua Navy Housing. It was next to the Navy Marine Golf Course, not very far from the Naval Station Pearl Harbor. Norma and I enrolled at Pearl Harbor Kai Elementary School. I was in grade 5 and she was in grade 1. My teacher was Mrs. Giddens. One of my classmates was the son of my father's ex-shipmate, Pacifico Jose Jr. They were from Cavite, Philippines. They lived next door to us, and we both joined the Cub Scouts. Another neighbor who arrived later was my godparents and their son Brigido Jr., who became junior number 3. I was junior number 2, as Pacifico, who came ahead of us, was known as junior number 1 in the Cub Scouts. Another family friend that also lived in the housing was Uncle Jose de Vega and Auntie Socorro de Vega. They had a son, Joe, and a daughter, Isa. Jose de Vega Jr. later on became an actor on Broadway and in the movies. He played the part of Chino in the movie West Side Story. Auntie Saco de Vega was friends with the Archuleta family as she and Ina came from the same town in Panama. My father was going through the telephone white pages when he found the name of his uncle, Feliciano Apuan, a cousin of his mother, and lives in Kalihi, a town close to Honolulu, with his family. I remember meeting Auntie Orang, Uncle Johnny, and Auntie Mary. I am still in touch with Auntie Mary today, as she lives with her husband in Anaheim. Auntie Mary and her husband, John Buntrock, were able to attend our 50th wedding anniversary celebration last October 20th, 2012. The cousins that I remember were Fidel, Lita, Peggy, and Bernard. The other relatives were the Ben Parasos from Kaimuki and the Villars from Waipahu. We were particularly close to our 2 aunts, Nora and another Mary, who were single at that time and had many suitors. On some occasions, they would go to see Filipino movies, and they would bring Norma and me along so we could translate for them. But most of the time, we would go with my ninong and ninang to the base theater. It only cost 8 cents to see a movie on base. My godfather had a car with a rumble seat, and that is where Brig and I would sit. These were fun times for us. At this time, I was getting interested in girls, and one of my classmates in the 6th grade was Joanne Blakely. Sometimes I would see her at the movie, and she would invite me to sit next to her. I would end up holding hands with her, and we did a lot of studying together. If ever there was a term for this, I would say it was first love or puppy love. A year later, my mom would give birth to her 4th child, a son, and he was named Aloha Lindo. He was born on July 2nd, 1948, at Tripler Army Hospital. I remember the fireworks going off in the sky over Pearl Harbor on our way home after picking them up from the hospital. Al, as he is called today, is the only Hawaii-born child of our parents. Our other adventures in Hawaii included going to the different beaches. Once we were at Kihi Lagoon, a military beach by Honolulu International Airport, when my sister Norma, while playing in the water, was swept by an unexpected wave to the deep part of the beach. She started screaming and was beginning to sink when Pacifico Jr. number 1 dove in and saved her from drowning. I was too far to even make a move, and we were so thankful that Pac was actually very close to her to be able to do something about it. On many occasions, we would go with our cousins and relatives around the island, stopping at some scenic areas like the Mormon Temple, and stopping at any beach for lunch. One of my cousins, Fidel Antonio Jr., would sometimes spend the weekend with us. He was much older than me, and I remember that it was he who taught me how to tell time. I saw him in Hawaii for the last time in 1949 when we left. I didn't see him again until I saw him in San Diego in 1990, when he was living in the San Diego suburbs in a small town called Santee with his family. I also spent some weekends with the Villars in Waipahu. Leela, or Grandma, is also our grandmother's cousin. My cousins David and Dolly were the ones that would entertain me. My Auntie Rose and Auntie Nora would also take me shopping and buy clothes for me. It was Leela, or Grandma, who would always cook pinakbet, a Philippine dish of different kinds of vegetables, mostly from their garden, and always served with fried spam. You know, I always knew that Hawaii consumes the most spam in the United States. Our Leela never failed to serve it to us whenever we came to visit them. Friends from school. In the 6th grade, my teacher was Ms. Tom. Some of my classmates who come to mind are Peter Crumpacker, whose father became an admiral in the Navy Supply Corps, Charles Stringfellow, David Shoup, David Ross, whose father would be a shipmate of mine aboard the USS Tecumseh, SSBN 628, David Story, Skippy Moore, Donald Wong, Edward Cleveland, Shirley Johnson, Carol Bow, Constance Smith, and Marjorie Sanderson. Others who I can recall only by their first name are Rosemary, Mildred, and Natalie. Playmates and neighborhood kids I remember were Ronnie Johnson, Angela Hope, Joanne and Bobby Blakely, Jean, Linda, Betty, and Butch Conger, the son of our Cub Scouts den father. I was also a member of the Junior Police Officer, or JPO. Our uniforms were a long-sleeved white shirt, long black tie, and khaki pants. We directed traffic in front of our school before and after class. We knew a lot of families that we always attended parties with. They were also Navy families. They were the Lunas, the Cabreras, who had a daughter named Lucy, the Hoses with their children Joe and Jolinda, the Ramirezes and their daughter Millie, the Ramoses family. Their son Danny was principal of Marian Catholic High School in Imperial Beach, California, and we had a chance to reminisce in 1988. Others were the De Vegas, the Batoons, the Tortonas, whose daughter Marietta was also a crush of mine, the Castanedas, whose children were Don, Norma, and Cesar, the Saldanias, who became godparents to Lindo, and their children were Toto and Connie. While living in Hawaii, our family car was a Jeep with canvas roof that could be put down. Norma and I would be in the back, and Mario was always seated on our mom's lap. There was an incident when we went to see a Filipino movie at Palama Theater downtown. When we were ready to leave the parking lot, a big dog like a collie jumped in the back with us. We actually had no choice but to give that dog a ride as he would not get off. I do not remember what happened. All I remember was he jumped off our Jeep as soon as we reached our house at Moanalua Navy Housing. Chapter 8. Leaving for the U.S. We were going to have a despedida party at home, and so my mom began the planning. This was the time when our life was settled down and my dad's different businesses were booming. We had a lanzones tree, similar to a loquat, in our backyard that had one bunch of fruit. My mom planted this tree when she was pregnant with me. It was the first thing she added to the property after acquiring it. It took 18 years before this lanzones tree began to have flowers, as it is uncommon for this particular tree to even survive in a place like Novaliches. Most lanzones thrives in the provinces of Laguna, Batangas, and sometimes Cavite. That is why my mother said we would not pick the fruits of our tree. We will just look and admire it until it falls off, or until it was time for the party. My mom's cousin, Kakang Martin Bautista, was walking around our backyard when he spotted the lanzones bunch. He did not hesitate picking it, as it was already very ripe. He started eating it and proudly announced to everyone around of his feet. When I realized what had happened, I just limped and could not utter a word. I looked at my mother and my siblings, who were also mesmerized to what we witnessed. I was so mad, but only blamed myself for not putting up a sign or anything to discourage anyone who would get close to our lanzones tree. Kakang Martin Bautista is the father of my cousin Rosie Pineda. Her husband, Manuel Pineda, was in the business of raising roosters used in cockfighting. He was Breeder of the Year several times in the Philippines, as well as our other cousin, Fernando Reyes, who has a farm in Lipa City, Batangas. He was also Breeder of the Year, once or twice. Our house and 2 residential lots, including all our businesses, were sold to my uncle Tayong. We were paid 20,000 pesos, equivalent to $10,000, as the exchange at that time was 2-to-1. The contract to purchase stipulated that we had the option of buying back our property. The main reason our dad decided to migrate to America was to give us, his children, the opportunity for a better life. I always had the perception that in America, money grows on trees. The other reason is that I was already 18. I could no longer be his dependent, and I had to earn U.S. citizenship on my own. My dad was also tired of the way the Philippine government was being run. Graft and corruption were everywhere, and you had to know someone before you could get served in any office you go to unless you pay someone. Hey, wait, that is still true today. There is no change. It is so difficult to hear someone say, "May I help you?" We were booked on another MSTS, Military Ship Transportation Service ship. This time it was the USNS General Patrick. There was one drawback because we were traveling on space availability only. The spaces for my mother and my siblings were only good up to Hawaii. My dad and I transferred below decks and rode with the troops for the trip to Port Huname, which is the Seabees base. They were returning to their home base after constructing the runways of Naval Air Station Kubi Point. During this leg, I met an American named Joe Black, who lives in Mira Mesa. We currently both attend the same church, and he is married to a Filipina named Connie. My mom, Norma, Mario, Aloha Lindo, Gloria, and Cesar, due to unavailability of cabin space, had to disembark in Hawaii. They were met at the pier by our uncle, Mr. Ben Paraso, our dad's cousin. They stayed with him at their house in Kaimuki until they were able to book their flight to San Francisco. When they arrived in San Francisco, they were met by my ninong and ninang, Mr. and Mrs. Brigido Tamayo, and they stayed at their home in Vallejo, California. Meanwhile, my dad and I were berthed with the troops below decks. With us was a group of Philippine Boy Scouts that were to attend a scout jamboree somewhere in the Midwest. They were given free ride by the United States government. I regret the fact that I did not seriously try to make friends with any of them, even though we were berthed next to each other. I later learned that some of these scouts would go to another jamboree in Greece. On the way home, their plane crashed. Later, they were honored by the Quezon City Council by naming streets after them. Upon arrival in Southern California, my dad and I boarded a Greyhound bus for Vallejo, California. We were met by my very kind Ninong Brigido Tamayo. To tell you how kind they were, our family, consisting of my dad, mom, and 6 children, lived with them for 4 months in a 3-bedroom, 1-bath house. I was the only one that slept in another bedroom with my godbrother, Brig. The rest of my family stayed in 1 bedroom. Timing was everything. We became experts in knowing when to use the bathroom for our daily existence, and of course, we tried to be as unobtrusive as we could possibly be. Brig worked at a local farm, and I was able to work alongside him. He introduced me to the foreman as another worker, and he asked if I knew how to pick fruit. I replied, "Yes, sir." Lucky for us, it was still summer, and there were many fruits to be picked in the nearby farms. There were many jobs if you were not picky. Joining Brig and me was a family friend, Julius Fernandez. We had to carry a wooden ladder, reinforced with metal brackets, along each orchard row. It was very heavy. I was questioned by the field boss if I could carry it, as he was worried I might not be able to keep up with the rest of the pickers. We were assigned a row of trees and given a metal ring shaped like a figure 8. The small ring would go to the middle finger, and we placed the big ring in the bottom of the fruit. If it did not fall through the ring, then it was big enough to be picked. This is how table pears are determined whether or not they may be harvested. As we approached the pear tree, we placed the ladder as close as possible to the center of the tree. Then we would climb it and begin picking fruit and using the ring to measure. If it was the right size, it was placed in a bag draped over our shoulder. I would not bother moving my ladder, as when I got on top, I could carefully move about picking most of the fruits using my talent in tree climbing. I got so good at this that I would even beat the group and finished first most of the time. I had to prove to the boss that I could handle it. After the first day, the boss checked my work. He wasn't a man of many words, but he gave me thumbs up and I could tell he was happy with my work. I was accepted as a regular picker. In the evening is when I would feel the pain and aches in my body. I was not really used to this kind of work. This also holds true for my father. We already had it made in the Philippines. My dad's different businesses were doing very well. So what made him decide to find a better place for us in America? In some ranches that grow prunes, they allowed the whole family to pick. The prune trees were loaded with fruits. It takes a shaker and a beater to get the fruits to fall to the ground where it is gathered by the gatherers. My dad and I would be the shakers, and we also would beat the tree with a big stick until all the fruits fell to the ground. This is where my siblings would take over. They would gather the plums and place them in boxes with our number on it where it would be placed in the tractor. It was almost like a game for the children. We had fun and got paid doing it. What a deal. Chapter 9. From Stockton to the U.S. Navy. Early life in Stockton. In September 1956, I enrolled at Vallejo Junior College for an associate degree as my law school transcript had to be evaluated before I could enroll in a law school. This was not practical, so I simply continued taking courses, and at the same time I enlisted in the U.S. Navy Reserves. I joined a submarine unit at Mare Island Naval Base and was sent to submarine school at Hunters Point Naval Shipyard in San Francisco, where I attended SP, Submarine Prospect, and SG, Submarine Graduate School. On weekends, I would be invited by the base librarian, Mrs. Soledad Fernandez, to spend the weekend with her family in Berkeley. Auntie Soli, as we knew her, is the sister of my dad's compadre, Pacifico Jose. She is also a very close friend of my ninang, Petronila Tamayo. This was a blessing for me as I did not have enough money to go home to Stockton, so I would just spend my time in the barracks. Joining the Fernandez family was a special treat for me. Auntie Soli would cook for us, and I became very close to her children, Jules, Lito, and Sol. Sometimes her family would be invited to some Filipino parties, and I would be with them. She also gave us a lot of hand-me-down clothes, which I wore. This was very nice because since our arrival in California, when I started working in the farms picking fruits, all my salaries were given directly to my mom except for $20, which I used to buy a new jacket. Auntie Soli was a special lady who treated me as her own son. One of the reservists in my class was John Jenkins from San Diego. He was to become my shipmate on the USS Tunney SSG-282. Today we are still friends and attend our ship's reunion every other year. On May 29, 1957, our youngest brother was born at the Mare Island Naval Hospital. He was named Michael, I believe, at a suggestion from one of the nurses who helped my mom deliver. My dad continued to work on the farms while waiting for a job. He followed the picking season, which took him from Suisun to Stockton and other outlying areas. My dad was not used to this kind of work. He did not give us any hint that he did not like what he was doing, but was always on the lookout for a better-paying job. He finally found work at the Veterans Hospital in Livermore, in the kitchen staff. I would drive him to work on Sunday evenings and pick him up on Friday nights. He only spent the weekend with us. We only had one car and the family needed it most, which is the reason I ended up driving him to and from Livermore. That car was a standard 1953 Pontiac sedan, which my father bought for $700. The proceeds of the sale of our property in the Philippines were slowly being depleted as it was used for the down payment of our house. I needed to get a job of my own to be able to help the family. As it stood, I could only work on weekends picking grapes, onions, or asparagus in the Stockton area. I made several friends working in the farms. They were Rudy Omania, the brother of my future brother-in-law, Louis Omania, Ken and Ben Gonzalez, Ted Candelaria, Conrado Bernardo, Bricio de Castro, and Tito Tana, whose uncle Leo was sometimes our foreman. Dad soon decided to buy a house in Stockton, as this is the center of the farmlands where he worked. I remember the realtor showing us different homes in the area. The realtor must have been a rookie because he was showing us homes in the northern part of town where no Filipinos, Asians, Mexicans, or blacks owned a home. In Stockton, everything north of Charter Way was considered the white area and everything south was the non-white area. I am sure that when my dad made the offer to purchase the house, discrimination was the last thing on his mind. When our realtor tried to back out of the deal, my dad maintained our rights in buying the house. That was our first experience with discrimination. After all, this was 1957, and the Civil Rights Act has not yet been passed by Congress. Driving around Stockton, I soon realized that there is such a thing as discrimination. But soon the neighbors began to know us, especially the kids, and they welcomed us into the neighborhood. My brothers and sisters were enrolled in the area public schools, and Norma and I were enrolled at Stockton College. I know that Mario and Lindo had their own paper route and made a lot of friends. They used their bikes delivering newspapers. Our commissary store is the one at the Rough and Ready Island. We would only go there when our dad was home, and sometimes we needed other items, but we had to wait. Being active duty in the U.S. Navy, I reported to Naval Station, Treasure Island, to be processed and to wait for transportation to Hawaii. On weekends, I would come home sometimes wearing my uniform. You see, deep inside me, I always had the desire to be in the U.S. Navy. As a matter of fact, my prayers every night always included the words, "And please God make me grow taller so that I can qualify to join the Navy." Now my prayers were answered. Our plane landed at Hickam Air Force Base, and we were met by a Navy bus that took us to the different ships tied up along the piers. I was taken to the submarine base, where the USS Tunney SSG-282 was tied up on Pier 1. The topside watch met me and welcomed me to the ship. After logging me in, he instructed me to report to the submarine barracks about a block away, where I was assigned a bunk and a locker. I would have 2 bunks, one in the barracks and one aboard the sub. On our duty days, we had to stay on board, and of course, when we were off, we stayed in the barracks. This was one leisure that we had over the sailors on the surface ships across the harbor from us. I was given liberty that afternoon, and I did not waste any time. I called my uncle Ben Parasso and had dinner with the family that evening. It did not take long for me to renew my acquaintances with my cousins, Almo, Carlo, and Cynthia. It had been 1949 when we saw each other last. The following day, I met the chief of the boat, COB. He is considered the most senior enlisted man on board a submarine. This position is unique only to the submarine service. He works directly under the direction of the executive officer, the second in charge of command. His assigned duties are the upkeep of the ship externally, the assignments of personnel to the different watches, ashore or at sea, maintenance of supplies and common spaces, like the showers, bathrooms, berthing compartments, everything topside, including the superstructure. I was assigned to the deck force, which means I would work for the leading seaman, and we all worked for the chief of the boat. You guessed it, I was given a scrapper, the tool we use to scrape rust off metal to prepare it for painting. This was a continuous cycle whenever the sub is in port. We had to look good externally and internally. The ship is always being prepared for painting by means of scrapping rusts and barnacles wherever it may be. It is then primed and sprayed with haze gray paint. I also learned how to make heaving lines, monkey's fists, and how to tie a bowline. I became an expert in the use of spray painting equipment and learned how to order supplies. I also got a Navy driver's license, as part of my duties was to be the driver when in port. We operated out at sea on a daily basis, and I learned how to steer the ship, man the bow planes, which controls the depth, and the stern planes, which control the angle of the ship as it runs underwater. When on the surface, I learned how to be a lookout. We report contacts by bearings in degrees. Directly ahead is 000, and to the right is 090. To the left is 270, and directly aft is 180, and so on. After a year in the deck force, I became the leading seaman, which means I got to supervise 8 to 10 personnel. Once I gave an order to one of my men, but he ignored me and even started calling me names. I got so mad that I chased him with a scrapper. When the Cowbee saw this, he put his arms around me and told me to stop. It was then that he called me Tiger, a name that would stick with me for the rest of my time on the Tunney. The mission of our submarine was to carry 2 Regulus missiles housed in a hangar behind the sail. Tunney was the first firing missile submarine. We normally operated with 2 other subs, the USS Cusk and the USS Carbonero, which acted as our guidance support. After we fired the missile, we guided it for about 200 miles towards the forward sub. It takes over guidance of the missile toward the sub nearest the target, where it would take over and guide the missile toward the target. When it is above the target, it dumps it and the missile hits the objective. This was how the early missile subs operated. One drawback was the submarine has to be on the surface before it can launch its missiles, and it took more than one submarine to hit a target 600 miles away. Today, our nuclear-powered missile firing submarines carries more than 16 missiles each, and they remain submerged while launching. Each missile is already preset. It knows where it is, and it knows where it is going. You just have to let it go. No guidance required. I made a trip to the dispersing office and made an allotment to my mother. I knew that my family could use all the help that we can get. My base pay was only $86 a month, but the allotment to my mother was for $100 a month. It is a blessing that I was stationed aboard a submarine, which made me entitled to hazardous duty pay and sea pay. I continued this allotment until our first son was born. Hawaii was a great place to be stationed, especially for a Filipino like me. There are so many restaurants that cater to us. One of the pleasures we look forward to is to go to town and eat at a Filipino restaurant where the food is almost like what Mom used to cook. My friends and I would do this almost every payday. I remember that in one of the restaurants we patronized, the owner had a very pretty niece that sometimes helped in serving the food. Her name was Thelma, and she had so many sailor suitors that whatever intentions I had, I completely erased them from my mind. Then we began meeting Filipino families, and one such family was the Paguyos. Their house was like a receiving station for us. We would always be welcome to stay, sometimes overnight. But the best part was that we were welcome to prepare home-cooked meals. In those days, it was so easy for us to ask our cooks in the sub for food to take off the ship. It was not unusual for us to just get a hunk of prime rib or several pounds of steaks. My friends at this time were Max and Zenny Paguyo, Romy Esteban, Armando Carlos, Romy Valerio, Romeo Andalian, Anita, and Bea. I was writing to Teresita Roxas all along, but somehow I really do not know what happened. She sent me a picture of her wearing a nun's outfit. My thinking was, she joined and became a nun or a sister. I then became very close to Zenny and also met many other girls on the other side of the island. One of them was Julie Sacramento. Her sister, Nora, was dating a friend of mine, Ernie Raimondo. They eventually got married and still live in Hawaii today. Chapter 10. Tahiti and My God-Brother Brig, Tunny Goes to Tahiti. My submarine schedule was to go on Regulus patrol by sailing north all the way to the Aleutian Islands. Sometimes we would stop by Kodiak Island or at Adak Island to fuel. Adak is famous for its national forest. There were 4 trees on the whole island. Someone said that there is a woman behind every tree in the island. I did not see anyone. After 4 patrols, we received orders to go south to the French Polynesian islands of Tahiti. We would be the first U.S. ship to ever visit Tahiti. To reach Tahiti, we must first cross the equator. This is where sailors who have crossed before are called shellbacks, and those who have not are called pollywogs. The initiation is very colorful. The royal family consisted of Neptunus Rex, or king. There is a queen, a royal baby, usually the one with the biggest belly, as the pollywogs are made to kiss his belly, and Davy Jones, the royal scribe. Neptunus Rex and the royal scribe are the 2 signatories to the certificate and shellback cards that are presented to the new shellbacks after the initiation. We crossed the equator twice that day, submerged on one and the other on the surface where the initiation took place topside. The shellbacks on board had it all planned. They have been saving our garbage since the day we left Pearl Harbor. It was placed in a canvas chute and hidden in the storage locker below decks. They also had chopped up rubber hoses about 3 feet long that they would use to beat us as we crawled through the chute. After surviving the crawling through the garbage while being beaten with a hose, we would then follow individual orders. The first order of business for me was I had to report to the royal barber, where I was given a royal trim or no hair. As a matter of fact, we pollywogs received the same kind of haircut. Next, we were given a concoction to drink. It was so bitter and spicy hot that I almost threw up. We were also given the order to kiss the royal tummy every time we hear the word pollywog. Chief Weinberg played the part of Neptunus Rex. Chief Davis was the royal baby. J.D. Crowley was Davy Jones and Mr. Schaefer was the royal queen, and they were all dressed for the occasion. I will never forget Chief Weinberg and Crowley, as they signed my card, which I still carry in my wallet today. As a matter of fact, I have 2 cards. The second one was from the USS Tecumseh SSBN 628. There were only 12 of us shellbacks, and we had to initiate more than 100 pollywogs. This time, I played the part of Davy Jones, and I signed more than 100 cards. Could it be that there is someone out there with a card in their wallet with my signature? In 1970, I enrolled at San Diego City College. On the first day of class, our professor was taking muster as he checked our seat location. After my name was called, he approached me and threw a card on my desk. He said that he has been carrying his card since he got out of the Navy and that he will never forget my name as he was on board the Tecumseh with me, and we initiated him. I, of course, signed his card. We arrived in Tahiti and tied up right in front of the marketplace in Papeete, the capital. A huge crowd met us, as it was the first time for them to see a U.S. submarine. After securing the lines, I ended up having the first topside watch, which means I had to be in my dressed whites and looking squared away with a belt, holster, and a .45 caliber pistol in my waist. I was responsible for the security of the ship and also the direct representative of the commanding officer. People were staring at me and some were trying to talk to me in French, which is one of the languages spoken there. I noticed a very attractive girl drive up on a Lambretta scooter. She smiled at me and waved. I waved back and also smiled. She was beautiful. She approached me and asked if she could see the submarine. I told her that if she can wait for another 2 hours, I would personally escort her and give her a tour. She said she would come back. At this time, the duty electricians were busy setting up a movie for showing later in the evening. The screen was on our sail and the projector on the pier. 2/3 of our crew were already on the beach at various bars. They told me that in the beginning, the ladies did not want to get near them. We found out later on that our original shellbacks were spreading the word around to the ladies in the bars that if they see U.S. sailors with real short haircut, that they should stay away from them, as they have VD. The MGM crew was shooting the film Mutiny on the Bounty. In Papeete, the same time the Tunny was there, and many of our crew members were cast as extras in the movie. Even Marlon Brando came on board for dinner as an invited guest of our captain. Before long, I was relieved of my watch, but I had to stay on board as I was in the duty section. Soon Miriam Prokop arrived in her scooter and saw me right away. She just came to me, and I motioned her to follow me. I introduced myself as Ram, my other name on board, and we proceeded to climb down the ladder in the forward torpedo room. Here I showed her the torpedoes and the tubes we used to fire them from. Then we went to the forward battery compartment. This is where the officers' berthing and dining room is located. At the control room is where everything is controlled, and I showed her the different watch stations. The bow and stern planes, different valves, and the steering helm is directly above the control room, which is the conning tower. She was just smiling all along. When we arrived at the after battery compartment where the dining room and galley is located, I had her sit in one of the booths. I then went down to our chill box, got some ice cream and cookies, and we just sat there eating and talking. I found out that her father is from Czechoslovakia and her mother is Tahitian. She has a brother in Paris studying and 2 sisters at home, one older than her and one younger than her. She agreed to meet me the next day, and we would go on her scooter, and she promised to show me the island. Meanwhile, she would stay and watch the movie with me. She was also an extra in the movie, Mutiny on the Bounty, as a dancer. She was a very good friend of Tarita, the leading lady whom Marlon Brando married. We went around the island in her Lambretta scooter. I sat behind her as she maneuvered the scooter and made our way all over the island. At times, I found myself hanging on for dear life. I had to be in uniform as we were not allowed to have civilian clothes aboard our sub. I had to hold my hat and my neckerchief as it was blowing all over. Miriam was good at her driving and, of course, knew her way around. I was getting the thrill of my life by just hanging on to her waist. I hardly noticed the beauty and serenity of Tahiti. We stopped at a waterhole. Actually, it was the mouth of the river, complete with a small waterfall with very lush greenery. It was not difficult to get lost in this kind of surroundings. She was wearing red pants and a white tank top, but inside she had on her bathing suit. She asked me if I wanted to swim, and fool me, I declined, as I did not have any swimming trunks. We ended up at her place, and I was introduced to her family, but first we went back to my ship, and I invited my 2 shipmates with me as Miriam had 2 sisters. We had a wonderful dinner prepared by her mother. In the evening, Mr. Prokop and his daughters played musical instruments, and the girls danced several Tahitian dances. I presented Miriam's dad with a brand new Navy-issue raincoat. I do not remember how we got back to our ship, but that night was a very memorable evening for me. I promised Miriam that I would write to her as soon as we returned to Hawaii. We exchanged several letters. In 1964, she became Miss Tahiti and was featured in Playboy magazine. Later on, I read in a magazine that she married an executive with the Pepsi-Cola company. Brig meets Nancy. In May of 1961, I received orders to attend RMA school in San Diego, California. Our family was now living in Livermore after selling our house in Stockton. The last time I was home was 2 years earlier when I took leave in Stockton. I had just re-enlisted, and with the re-enlistment money I was able to buy a used car for Norma so she did not have to drive Dad to work. On leave again, before reporting to my school, I visited my ninong and ninang in Vallejo and discovered that Brig was also there. He had plans on driving down to San Diego as his parents just bought him a brand new black 1961 Impala convertible. Our plan was he will pick me up from Livermore and together we would drive down to San Diego. On the way, we would stop and visit friends. My ninang had a long talk with me while I was visiting. She said she heard that I have a Filipina girlfriend and that I should find someone for Brig. I promised her I would try. The night before I was to leave, my father confided to me that he had a daughter, born during the war, that is possibly living in San Diego. Needless to say, I was shocked to hear about this for the very first time. No wonder I heard my mom arguing with my dad recently in the middle of the night when all the children were asleep. This is one thing I remember very well. Our parents never quarreled in front of us. My father sat me down and explained in detail his experience during the war. He honestly believed that his family perished during the bombing of Manila. He just assumed that my mom and I were casualties when the Japanese started bombing Manila, as his crippled submarines slowly escaped to Australia. Later on, he was assigned to the Navy commissary store in Panama. There, he met Ina, a lovely young Panamanian. Because of the war situation, most Panamanians were dependent on the Americans for economical support. He lived with Ina, and she bore him a child, a daughter whom they named Gwen. After the war, he learned through the Red Cross that we were alive. He immediately requested duty to the Philippines and was lucky enough to be assigned to the Philippine Sea Frontier Command in Pasay City, Philippines. Before he left Panama, he remembered Gwen walking with him and was running after him holding an ice cream cone. He entrusted the care of his partner and daughter to one of his close friends and member of his crew, Petty Officer 2nd Class Manuel Archuleta. Mr. Archuleta in turn married Ina and adopted Gwen, their only child. When he retired from the U.S. Navy, they settled in San Diego. Brig picked me up in Livermore and the two of us proceeded to drive down south to San Diego. We stopped in La Mirada just south of L.A. as I wanted to see an old flame of mine whom I met in Hawaii. They stopped there on their way to California as their father became ill. The father was admitted to Tripler Army Hospital and they stayed with their relatives, the Abadia family. It was nice to see Myrna again. She is so full of laughter, very funny, and loves telling jokes. Their mother, Aling Toyang, remembered me as well and invited us to stay for dinner, and we were welcome to stay and rest before we returned to our driving. Aling Toyang prepared a very delicious meal, which we greatly appreciated. After dinner, I noticed a picture of their other daughter, and I showed it to Brig. We found out that Myrna's older sister, Nancy, was in the waves, but will be getting out soon. She was presently assigned in New York. Brig became very interested, as we also found out that it won't be long before she is discharged from the Navy, and she will be arriving in San Francisco and most likely would be met by their cousins living in Alameda. We ended up staying overnight. I already asked Myrna to keep me informed of her sister's plans, as we both wanted for the two of them to meet. Brig got her phone number, and that night they were able to talk to each other. That same year, Brig and Nancy got married. Before the wedding, Nancy's friend, Tessie Galang, arrived from New York, where she was attending a fashion school. The four of us went to San Francisco and had dinner there. I learned that Tessie's family owned a fashion school in Manila called Madonna's Fashion School. At the wedding reception, I caught the bride's garter, which meant I would be the next to get married. I made sure I had the phone number of Madonna's in Manila. Actually, Tessie Galang gave me a note for her mother. In June 2012, Brig and Nancy celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary at the Mandalay Bay in Las Vegas. Present were my wife and I, and Roger and Tessie Biglang Awa. They have 2 daughters and 3 grandchildren. The older daughter, Nancy Stella, lives in Los Angeles with her son, Bryce. Their younger daughter, Stephanie, is married to Ron Rivera. They have 2 children. Their son, Christopher, is with Disneyland, and their daughter, Courtney, is a sophomore at UCLA and plays for the women's softball team. She is one of their star pitchers. Today, Ron is the head football coach of the Carolina Panthers of the NFL and was named Coach of the Year. Before this, he was the defensive coordinator for the San Diego Chargers. I got to see many preseason games, thanks to Ron and Stephanie for those freebies.